Hey everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I am the festival director of Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. I'm also an arts reporter for Georgia Voice. I'm so excited to be able to talk today to Andrew Rossi, the director of the fascinating new docuseries on Netflix, The Andy Warhol Diaries. Thanks so much for joining us today, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have to say, I'm just absolutely fascinated by this series. So congratulations for doing it. What made you want to work on this?
I've always been drawn to Andy Warhol's work. Its color palette, its focus on iconic images since I was a child.
Sure.
And he's a figure that also occupies the culture in a way that kind of gives permission to people to be themselves. I think the factory was a place in New York in the 1960s that was very radical. And that sort of legacy of creating a sort of safe space for people existed also in the 1980s when I was a young person and figuring myself out. I'm bisexual, and Andy was someone who, in this moment of intense homophobia, was one of the few public figures that seemed perhaps not necessarily clearly out,
Mhm.
but in a queer space.
Sure.
And so there was a queerness that was a companion to the intense artwork and the sort of visual language that he had created that I was drawn to. And I wanted to understand what that connection was and to understand the humanity behind him, because I think it's kind of strange that this person who is so influential is so unknown to us. And
Exactly.
right. And so part of that is because of the public performance, but it's also, I think, the product of Andy's effort to hide himself and to create an armor. And
Mhm.
so I wanted to make the Andy Warhol Diaries as a series in order to understand what was going on and sort of pull the curtain back.
Did it take did it take a lot to get the blessing from the Warhol State to do this?
It was definitely an involved process. I started
Okay.
back in 2011.
Wow.
I had just finished a film called Page One,
Yeah.
and it took a long time. But the great thing is that I was able to reread the diaries
Mhm.
and really formulate an approach that I hope is a unique one. I wanted to sort of decode the text, which is over 850 pages long, and figure out what was happening in Andy's personal life and how that relates to the later artwork that he created, which in many ways has been ignored, certainly by previous um, documentaries, but also in some ways the scholarship has just started recently to unpack his Last Supper series, his Rorschach and camouflage paintings, and even his work with folks like Christopher Makos with the altered images,
Mhm.
to understand how his queerness was really driving a lot of that work.
Okay. There's a quote that I picked up on pretty quickly, to the effect of Andy sort of wanted to be machine-like with not much emotion involved. Can you talk about that and why Andy chose that route?
Yes, Lucy Sant, who appears in the series, says that Andy's heart was so fragile that it was almost wrapped in gauze. He grew up in Pittsburgh, the son of immigrants, and always thought that his skin had blemishes and that his nose was too bulbous. He became bald very early on, and just felt that he was physically not attractive. And I think that, combined with um, his presence in the world as a gay man that could not sort of modulate enough to pass,
Mhm.
made him very much an outsider.
Okay.
And so he created this armor, this performance, to try to transcend the feeling of pain that he felt. And so, as Lucy Sant says, he wanted to somehow be like a machine that didn't have feelings. And so he often said, yes, I do have feelings, but I wish I didn't.
Okay.
And that was part of what inspired my thought that an AI voice could bring him and his voice to life in the series.
A lot of what some of the early stuff that I read about Andy Warhol suggested that he might be asexual, but I mean, obviously he was not. I mean, can you talk about, again, his decision to not really to sort of downplay the romantic relationships in his life?
Yes, he responds to direct questions about whether he thinks about sex with interviewers by saying he doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
and he did have a relationship to physical encounters that is reported to be not necessarily the standard. And I think that also gets us into a tricky conversation about what is normal or what is standard or not. I think everyone's access to physical intimacy is unique. And in fact, that's something that Bob Colacello says in episode 4, talking about Andy and whether or not he actually engaged in physical sex with John Gould.
Mm-hmm.
Um, R. Curry Hay also chimes in to say that, maybe for him, sex was being in bed and eating popcorn and watching a movie. But I think the point is that Andy did have intimate queer relationships with people like John Gould and with Jed Johnson, with whom he
Mm-hmm.
shared a bed. But he couldn't talk about that. He
Yeah.
could not be in an out domestic partnership with someone like Jed, who he lived with for 12 years, and still traffic in a world that deemed homosexuality as being illegal or a mental illness. And so in his effort to be a successful artist and get commissions to paint portraits, he decided to keep his sexuality veiled or obscured or make a joke out of it in a way that was very common at the time among other people who were gay. And so unpacking that and having people really reckon with what that meant for him, all with the diaries and his own voice, talking about his queer longing and his feelings of loneliness, hopefully adds up to a portrait in the series that helps us understand Andy better and ourselves.
Okay, you dipped a little bit into my next question. I was going to ask you about the homophobia that was present when Andy was growing up, and even in his adult years.
Yes, so he grew up in Pittsburgh and was born in 1928, and this is a period in which he is surrounded by people in the neighborhood he grew up with
Mm-hmm.
who will not accept him as a gay young man. He's going to church, in a Byzantine Catholic church that is very orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
and homosexuality is not permitted in that context as well. And when he first arrives in New York City, he tries to present drawings, homoerotic drawings of young men that he's drawn in his studio, to the Tanager Gallery, which rejects them out of hand as not being art. How, they're really sensitively rendered images of young men in sexual
Mm-hmm.
positions or alone, and they're beautiful, but just because of their gay content, they literally would not qualify to be hung on a wall.
Wow.
And so that is a theme that Andy returns to in the 1970s when he makes the sex parts Polaroids.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, this is an example of how we can track his personal relationships. He's in a moment with Jed where they have been living together for a while, and he's searching for some new input. And he starts going to Studio 54, and the sexual revolution is opening doors for him, and he's then doing an artistic exercise with Victor Hugo called the Sex Parts Polaroids, where he brings men to the factory to photograph them. And those photos in some ways look like pornography, but they are art, and they harken back to those Boyd book drawings from the 50s. So that's yet another way for Andy to explore his sexuality. And indeed, Benjamin Liu says that this is a moment where he thinks Andy was coming to peace with his homosexuality, all because he couldn't live his life and his truth um, as he wanted to because of the social restrictions.
Exactly. There is some amazing archival footage here, but how did you whittle all this down? I mean, how difficult was it to whittle all this down?
Absolutely. Well, I worked with the editor, Stephen Ross,
Mhm.
and archival producers or co-producer Adam McGill, and worked with the Warhol Foundation to get a blanket license to all of Andy's artwork, photographs, and personal effects, which are actually kept at the Warhol Museum in time capsules. And I wrote scripts to basically triangulate between
Okay.
those visual materials, the diaries in Andy's voice, and then the events, to hopefully create a cinematic language that's combining, a straightforward story, but also a visual landscape that's kind of commenting on the two.
One of the things I've always been impressed by about Andy Warhol is how he was able to constantly reinvent himself. Can you talk about that?
Definitely. I think reinvention is core to Andy's worldview.
Mhm.
He created some works that use advertising slogans, which I think give a window into how he looked at advertising as aspirational and not just about consumer culture, but actually how to go from before to after. So
Okay.
one of his great works is called Before and After, and it depicts an advertising image of a woman who's had a nose job. And so you see her before she had the nose job and afterwards, and it's clear that there's a transformation that took place. Andy, I think, was always trying to explore the ways in which he could transform to achieve a goal, frequently that goal being love and connecting with a romantic partner. So he has another work that's called um, Be Somebody with a Body. And that's an image of a weightlifter with an image of Christ juxtaposed. And that also relates to another work called Make Him Want You,
Mhm.
which depicts a man and a woman and an American flag. Um, these are all these sort of admonitions to do something and in order to make yourself more attractive to a partner.
Okay. I've often wondered what what Andy Warhol would think of today's society with social media and everybody having their 15 or 20 minutes of fame. How do you think Andy would have, succeeded in this generation?
Well, I mean, the fascinating thing is that the 15 minutes have become 15 seconds when you think about the length of TikTok performances or
Exactly.
Instagram stories. I think, it's impossible to say what Andy would have thought.
Mhm.
Andy contradicted himself all the time throughout his many years. I think the diaries do open the door to understanding some truths about him. First of all, his connection and love for people like Jed Johnson, John Gould, Jean-Michel Basquiat, um, his description of movies, and his aesthetic sensibility, his connection to female protagonists in those. There are
Mhm.
things that we can get, but we can't totally know what he would have thought about TikTok or
Exactly.
Instagram. I mean, certainly they are consistent with his prediction
Mhm.
that people would continue to find avenues for self-expression and performance that are almost addictive and that become part of a person's understanding of themselves and feeling good about themselves. They are inextricably connected to our self-worth. I mean, certainly for him they were.
Mhm.
Maybe by the time, in 40 years from when he died, he would have come to see that that's toxic and something that he rejected. But it is true that he understood how the culture was heading in that direction.
One of the things that you obviously deal with in the docuseries is the shooting. Can you talk a little bit about the shooting and the effect it had on Andy, both personally and professionally?
So Valerie Solanas was a person who was part of the factory scene and had written a screenplay, and in fact appears in one of Andy's movies, I Am Man. And she had submitted this screenplay to Andy and Fred Hughes, who was president of Andy Warhol Enterprises, and had thought that Andy was going to produce the movie, and
Mhm.
was upset that she hadn't heard back. And I think she also um, suffered from other mental health problems, and also had other um, uh, had another agenda with Andy. That's part of her feminist view and manifesto.
Mhm.
Um, but what happened was she went to the factory and shot him, and he had to go to the hospital and have surgery, and was actually pronounced legally dead during the surgery because the bullet had gone through so many
Mm.
internal organs that the doctors thought he would never survive. So after many hours of surgery, he emerged, and as Bob Colacello says, clearly had a will to live.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of foundational to understanding Andy post 1968, because he constantly sort of seems to be living on borrowed time after that. He has a real appreciation of the fragility of life, and already his approach to mortality and sort of the existential crisis of being, just one breath away from heaven and hell, as he says in a later work, is really compounded. And so when we look at the later part of his artistic work, it's important to um, going past the idea that he was a has-been and that he was just doing celebrity portraits, to see how he actually was very much in a raw relationship with the spiritual questions of life,
Mhm.
trying to find meaning and grapple with the fact that, as he described it, reality seems less real than television. There's something, and this comes in when he's talking about the Diana Ross concert, something about a person, a celebrity on a stage, or something about what he sees on television feels more perhaps safe and real to him than actual life, which is full of the pain and heartache and indignities of just dealing with other people.
Okay. Can you talk about getting Ryan Murphy involved?
Sure. So I started the project back in 2011, and after we had finally obtained the rights, went with my executive producer Josh Braun to meet with Ryan in 2018, and he was enthusiastic about this vision that I shared of trying to understand Andy through his romantic relationships, and to sort of unerase his position as a queer artist and a queer man. And so it was under his banner at Netflix that we were able to make the series.
Okay, great. I wonder, this is kind of a loaded question, but maybe you can give me a cliff notes. Can you just talk a little bit about Andy's legacy and how he is able to shape the lives of so many others after him?
Yes, I mean, I think, many people are watching the series now, and they talk about their experiences of encountering Andy's work or his
Mhm.
sort of cultural footprint when they were young. And certainly that applies to me too. There's something about Andy Warhol and the artwork that he made that is accessible. Um, and knowing his personal story um, is very fulfilling. It's very relatable. He was very vulnerable,
Mhm.
very insecure in a lot of ways, even though he was so successful. And so there's something about understanding that I think tells us something about ourselves as a balm to our own feelings.
Okay. All right. The series is the Andy Warhol Diaries. It's now playing on Netflix. It's fascinating. I completely enjoyed it. The director was Andrew Rossi. Thank you so much for the series, and it was great talking to you today.
Great to talk to you too. Thanks,
Thanks
Jim.
so much.